Hi, welcome back to Psychology is a Human Science here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the first one in a series of 2 or 3, I'm not quite sure, about existential psychology, which is going to be a movement very much related to what we talked about in the previous 2 videos about phenomenological psychology. So, let's crack open your notes. Existential psychology. Existential psychology, first thing to notice about it is that it's very much based upon the movement of existentialism, which is a movement in philosophy, also to an extent a movement in arts and literature and a larger culture probably of the West. At any rate, probably right from the beginning you ought to know that yes, it's very much a philosophically based mode of psychology. In that way, it is very much like phenomenology. In fact, so much so that the 2 movements basically overlap each other, both within philosophy and also within psychology. So, existentialism, I glossed it for you in your notes, a movement in 19th and 20th century philosophy that seeks to explore and illuminate the nature of existence or being. So here's an easy slam dunk for you. The word existentialism kind of has the word existence already embedded in it, and so you can take that as your clue that it's definitely going to be focusing on illuminating the meaning or structure of existence or being. Consequently, very much an ontological emphasis. At any rate, in your notes, the next thing is a Venn diagram. Yes, a Venn diagram, flashing you back to your 3rd grade or 4th grade classroom when you learned about Venn diagrams, hopefully, that illustrates the interrelationship between phenomenology and existentialism. And basically, it's an overlapping type relationship. So, if you look at that diagram in your notes, the left circle represents phenomenology. And of course, in a way, indirectly, it refers to phenomenological psychology, which we discussed, as I said before, in the previous 2 videos. Consequently, the leftmost circle contains pure or transcendental phenomenology, and I put the name Edmund Husserl there, who hopefully you remember, and because you've been hearing about him. And then there's the overlap part of that Venn diagram, the middle section, that has to do with existential phenomenology. Once again, we talked about that in the very last video before this one. And I put the 3 names that we discussed up there also. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, the new thing about the Venn diagram is the rightmost part. So the rightmost third, as it were, of the 3-part diagram. So that's going to have to do with something that I've called literary existentialism. And what that is basically, when I said that existentialism also is a movement in literature, well, the thing about that is sometimes existentialism takes formal philosophical forms. For the most part, that has to do with existential phenomenology. However, there are literary forms of existentialism too, where basically the ideas are cast in terms of narratives, stories, plays, poetry, and things like that. So I put a few names up there that perhaps you've heard of. Søren Kierkegaard, so a early 19th century Danish existential thinker and theologian, very avid Christian thinker for sure. Friedrich Nietzsche, a latter 19th century German thinker. Albert Camus, a French-Algerian existential writer, mid-20th century for the most part. Martin Buber, a Judaic theistic existentialist writing in German, and Franz Kafka, of course, Czechoslovakian, or I guess nowadays Czech Republic. Okay, so that hopefully illustrates the overlap between phenomenology and existentialism a little bit for you, and hopefully it also separates out and helps you understand the placement of some of these names that you'll hear about, not in this video, but in the next one for sure. But at least for now, you have an initial idea of the lay of the land. So the point is, sometimes existentialism takes explicitly phenomenological forms, and sometimes it takes more artistic or literary forms. Okay? it's always possible to see the literary forms as an informal kind of phenomenology, of course, because really what they're about is at least making an appeal to your experience as a reader to see if their revelations about the structure of existence more or less coincide with your own. But really, formal phenomenology is not like literature. Believe me, when you pick up a book in formal phenomenology, you know for sure, very fast, very quickly, that you're reading hardcore, dense philosophical inquiry. When you pick up a book in literary existentialism, it's not necessarily clear at first that you're even reading a philosophy book, necessarily. All right, so that's the basic lay of the land. Biggest name. He's one of ours, an American. That's not really true of most existential thinkers. The Americans are definitely the exception here rather than the rule. So Rollo May. Wait a minute, Rollo May, where have you heard that name before? Oh, he was one of the humanistic psychologists we talk about. Here's the thing about Rollo May. His work was broad enough to allow him to be classified both as a humanistic psychologist but also as an existential psychologist. So in fact, he's the biggest name in existential psychology. There are others, but he's definitely the most famous one. So you've heard his name before. And what you might infer from that is in fact, what you might infer from this video so far is that there's not only an overlap between phenomenology and existentialism, there's also an intersection with humanistic psychology. And if you're inferring that, you're definitely inferring the right thing, because they definitely share elements in common for sure. And the fact that we're talking about Rollo May once again, in a way, is an indicator of that. So, Rollo May, the most famous. Now, in the previous thinkers, in the previous video, I made mention of what I thought were their most famous works, one for each one. But in the case of Rollo May, there's not one book that's really definitively his most famous, so I gave you some of his more famous ones. So The Discovery of Being, Psychology and the Human Dilemma, Love and Will. So there are three examples of some pretty famous ones by him for sure. So, like I said before, existential psychology is definitely a philosophically based mode of psychology. Hopefully you're getting that idea. There's definitely a heavy ontological emphasis. In other words, focusing on being or existence, and implicitly focusing on what reality is about too. And at this point you may wonder, or maybe not, I guess if you've been watching the last 5 videos, this may be an obvious thing to you. Like, why would anyone want to adopt this approach that hybridizes a movement in philosophy like existentialism with its ontological emphasis and the traditional project of psychology? Why would anyone seek to sort of have an amalgam of those two things? And I think the reasonably obvious answer is that, well, you know, psychologists are mostly interested in human beings. Yeah, every now and then there's a psychologist that's specifically interested in something like animal behavior or something like that. But for the most part, 99% of psychology is about human beings. Well, the thing about human beings is they're a type of being, namely a human being. So in a way, the whole ontological question has insinuated itself into psychology's proper topic matter, although the idea that human being is itself a kind of being is not often taken seriously in mainstream psychology. Well, in existential psychology, for sure it is. Okay, so the whole rationale for the approach is that, well, if you really want to study human beings, at some point you have to ask yourself, what is being about, such that we're so damn interested in human beings? Okay, so posing that question, which is probably from the point of view of our prevailing Western cultural practices in academia and even more generally throughout our culture, seems like a really strange question. Well, if you don't know what the word being is, why don't you just buy a dictionary? Well, it's not quite as simple as that. See, here's the thing about the question of being. It's the kind of question that you thought you knew the answer to until someone really started asking you. Okay, so it can be sort of a weird, slippery question, because most of us use the verb to be, you know, all the time. And But when someone asks, well, what do you really mean by that? It can be almost embarrassing to discover that it's a much trickier question than it seems like at first, and that the easy answers, here's the first easy answer. Well, like something is when it exists in reality. That, of course, is not much of an answer because it just defers the question. Oh, well, okay, well, what's reality then? All right, so at any rate, so human beings are a type of being. Being is fundamental to what we are. Okay, so next part of this video, that was the first arc of this video. Next arc of this video, which will carry us through to the end, is to outline some of the main ideas or features of existential psychology. So some of these are going to be more on the order of reminders of stuff that we've talked about before in the last couple of videos, and some of them are going to be new. The first one is more of a reminder because you've heard about this idea before. Understanding existence in terms of being in the world, hyphenated. Okay, so give you a second or two to try to remember what that meant. Oh, by the way, here's what it means. Like, it's the idea that what we are as subjective experiencing beings is intimately related to what the world is as an objective entity, that those two are always in a very intimate and reciprocal relationship with each other. So being in the world means that what we are as beings is intimately related to the world. The world is intimately related to what we are as beings. Remember also, that German word that we use, that portmanteau word, Dasein, right? So the easy way of sort of thinking about that is being in the world, because that's how it's often translated. Okay, so that's more of a reminder. Note that this idea of Dasein, or being in the world, is more or less tantamount to a holistic way of understanding things. Okay, understanding things in terms of the totality of what we are, which would include the objective side of our being, which is probably most obviously crystallized in the physical realities of our bodies, and also the subjective side of our being, which is probably most evident in the fact that we experience things. All right, so we're here to study all of that in relation to the world, okay, the universe ultimately. So being in the world is a way of expressing this sort of holistic animating spirit of a bunch of the modes of psychology we've talked about thus far in this class, and it won't end here either. So it's holistic. Okay, so existential psychotherapy, repeating the phrase to give it a little bit of emphasis. So we're moving toward the question of how can you possibly deal with psychological disturbance from an existential point of view. Well, because it's holistic, it aims at change not just in one or two dimensions of a person's being, but it's the idea that like real deep change in our psychological being has to do with changing the entire pattern of our lives, and not just changing how we think a little bit or how we feel a little bit or how we interrelate with others a little bit or anything like that. Like really what we're after is change in the entire pattern or the entire Gestalt. That's a German word that means the entire form of our lives. Okay, so rather than just seeking change in one or two parts of it. All right, so, and hopefully, boy, you're getting the idea that, wow, okay, so existential psychotherapy is definitely running with this idea of holism and applying it to the task of psychological disturbance. Okay, so how do we change with respect to the entire pattern of our lives? That's the question right now. Well, from an existential psychological point of view, that kind of change has to be rooted in some sort of realization of the actual reality of our existence. And this is going to not be a reminder for you. This is probably going to be new stuff right now. So, how do you experience your existence as real? That's the essential question. And it's sort of a conundrum, to say it that bluntly and that crudely. Like, well, let me pose it as a question. Like, have you ever experienced your existence as real? Have you ever experienced sort of the raw, basic reality of being? Not necessarily being in any mode of particularity, but the raw reality of being itself. And probably some of you will say like, well, maybe I think, and maybe others will say like, WTF, dude, like, what are you talking about? It's like, okay, well, if you're in the WTF category, then consider the possibility that at some point in your life, it may be possible for you to experience the raw, fundamental reality of your existence, and perhaps a wonder about what that might be like. So, now what it might be like can be either sort of positive or negative. Like, it doesn't necessarily take any one distinct form. Like, you could realize the reality of your existence in any context, any moment of your life. You could do it right now as you're watching this video, for that matter. You know, some of them are more sort of anxiety provoking, like extreme moments of anxiety, like panic attacks possibly. It could take the form even of a panic attack, because one thing about a panic attack is when you're in the middle of a panic attack, you don't have to wonder whether you exist or not. Like, the reality of your existence is definitely right there for you. You don't need to wonder about whether you're asleep or semi-asleep. It's like, the problem with a panic attack is things have gotten too real, in a way, along the dimension of anxiety especially. Or it could take more depressive forms, you know, like sort of melancholic type forms. Or it could take like very happy forms too, you know, like a kind of exuberance about being. It's like, oh my goodness, the unbearable lightness of my being. And I'm actually referring to the title of a movie and a book too, actually, in the existential tradition. But you can be sort of caught up in the ecstasy of things, the ecstasy of your life, the ecstasy of your moment, and realize the raw fundamental reality of your life, of your existence, in the mode of ecstatic experience, or you know, exuberant experience, or happy, just happy experience, something like that. So it can take a whole bunch of different forms, but what's common to all of them is you're realizing the fundamental nature of your existence as such. Now, Rollo May gives a special name to this. Boom, here comes the name: the I am experience. Okay, so whether it's happy or sad or anxious or any other sort of mode, the I am experience has to do with experiencing the deep reality of your being. Okay, experiencing your being as something real. And now, what you might infer from this is like, wow, our culture hardly ever invites us to do that. And if it seems strange to you, that's probably the reason why, because our culture drags us hither and yon and this and that, and distracts us with this, that, and the other thing, and it hardly ever leaves us sort of time and space for something like what Rollo May is describing here, to have an I am experience. Like, you know, we're so damn busy, like trying to get stuff done, and then when we're not trying to get stuff done, we're on the weekend trying to be entertained, and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And hardly ever do our cultural prevailing values leave us much room for an I am experience every now and then. I think personally, I'll give you sort of a personal sort of tilt on this. I think one of the best ways of experiencing this is through meditation. But if you've been watching this videos, you probably know that I'm sort of an avid meditator. That's a little bit of a contradiction, but you know, like I meditate pretty often with my wife, usually, actually. Not to get too technical or personal about it. Okay, so I put in your notes at the top of the next page. What does it feel like to experience your existence as real? Like I said, you don't need to meditate to do this. Like prayer, I think, could be a possible mode of doing this. Like, if you pray sort of deeply enough and long enough, you can possibly have a moment of this sort of revelation, as it were. You know, and what's revealed is, you know, the reality of your life in some basic way. Okay, the idea here, why is the I am experience so necessary to psychological change, the way Rollo May has been describing it? Because without some felt connection to your existence as real, the most we can hope for, as it were, is to rearrange the furniture on the deck of the Titanic that is sinking. Okay, so if you rearrange the furniture, your cognitive furniture, as it were, on the deck of your life, okay, you're thinking a little bit differently, but guess what? The ship is still going down. If you rearrange the affective furniture, affective, by the way psychologists use this term, it refers to the emotions, feelings, passions, stuff like that. So if you rearrange your affective furniture a little bit, well, guess what? Like, the ship is still going down, and so on. This is part of why they're not interested in like just having you feel something a little bit differently or thinking a little bit differently or something behaving a little bit differently. They're after changing the whole gestalt, because that's where real change lies. But the thing is, like, that's not going to happen unless there's some kind of connection to your existence as real, because that's the fundamental reality you're living out. So let's see how I said it in your notes. Without a felt connection to the reality of one's existence, changes in our lives can only be relatively superficial rearrangements of our thoughts, feelings, habits, etc., not deep alterations in the fundamental pattern of who we are. Well, I think that more or less crystallized what I just said in the last few minutes anyhow. So that's the first thing, I'm experienced. Second thing that existential psychotherapy aims at is something like authenticity or authentic existence. See, it's not just enough to have an I am moment every now and then. Like, hopefully what you're really heading toward as you change by way of psychotherapy, or even just change more generally in your life, is something like becoming more authentic in who and what you are, right? So less of a robot, less of a clone, less of a cookie cutter person, which happens all too often, partly for the reason I mentioned earlier, that, boy, our culture really encourages that kind of sheep-like behavior, you know, just keep going, bah, bah, you know, like keep sort of living like that and you'll be rewarded. Well, maybe that's not really what life is ultimately about, is being the best sheep possible. Who knows? You know, so authenticity. What is it to be authentic? Now, the trick here is the way existentialists think about authenticity is not necessarily the way you would sort of think about it in regular English, because in regular English the word authentic means something like genuine, or even like sincere or honest, like when someone's being authentic. Usually what we mean is, in regular English, is something like, well, they're being honest with us or something like that. But what existentialists mean, and they're taking this from one of those thinkers that we mentioned earlier, Martin Heidegger, is that you're moving toward the deepest possibilities of your being, okay? And hopefully this is starting to sound a little bit like something we described in the humanistic videos about self-actualization. Yeah, there's a reason for that, because Abraham Maslow semi-lifted this from Martin Heidegger and existential thinking. Remember what I said in the beginning of the video, that there's a fair amount of overlap between humanistic psychology, phenomenological psychology, and existential psychology. Now you're seeing it in practice. So authenticity is about glimpsing and living out our deepest unique potentials in life, basically starting to live our own lives. This is in contrast to what we normally do most of the time, which is inauthentic existence or inauthenticity. Well, what's inauthenticity about? Well, it's about deferring to how other people want you to live in one way or another, or tell you to live. Right? So mostly we go through our lives, here's what we do. It's sort of like we look around and see what other people are thinking, well, how other people are feeling, how other people are behaving, and we more or less model our own on that, what other people's values are. And probably the most obvious place to see this is in adolescence and early adulthood, you know, when probably you've lifted off a lot of stuff from your parents in one way or another, and you're sort of getting out into the early adult world and seeing if it fits you or not. Right? I sometimes like to think of it like this, like everyone is sort of given a suit early in life to wear. It's like your parents give you a kind of suit to wear, and as you grow up and start entering into early adulthood, you get out on your own. One of the things that hopefully happens is you notice how the suit fits you in various ways and how it does not fit you in other ways. Like maybe the legs are too long or too short, or maybe it's too tight around the waist, or maybe it, you know, whatever, the sleeves are too long. So part of your task, metaphorically speaking, in early adulthood is to hopefully start tailoring your suit so that it really fits you and not just some generic person, or not just who your parents want you to be, but that it really fits you as a unique and distinct person. Like that would be, I think, a kind of metaphor for thinking about authenticity. Like you start to tailor your life so that you're actually starting to live your life and not someone else's life for them. And who the someone else is almost doesn't matter. You know, it could be your parents. That's a common thing early on in life, but as you go on, it could be TV, it could be the larger culture, it could be whatever, people in your neighborhood. Almost doesn't matter, because the real challenge is not for you to conform or just to obey the implicit or explicit edicts of other people. The real challenge is to become who and what you are. And that may sound like a weird, paradoxical, Zen-like formula, but it's not bad. Actually, it's one with a long pedigree. There's a form of it in Nietzsche's thought, a form of it in Kierkegaard's thought, and it originally comes from a playwright in classical Greek antiquity whose name is Pindar, but that's beside the point right now. Okay, so inauthenticity, how we usually just conform to what other people are doing, thinking, valuing, usually by way of imitating other people and or just obeying orders. That's how we settle in life. All right, so hopefully existential psychotherapy, change at the existential level, has to do with sort of passing beyond all that and entering into your own life, starting to live your own life. And by the way, let's make an obvious point here that you see professors and students can be in that same circuit too. Like one dynamic that sometimes plays out is students think that they have to think like their professor, think the same thoughts, think the same ideas, value the same things, and that's not the deep point of your experience in college. The deep point is for you to have contact with how your professors think so that you can find and create your own relation to life. You getting it? Okay, so like having contact with what we say in a deep sense is just an occasion to figure out what you say. Okay? So you're not just here to be an imitator. You're not just here to be a clone. You're here to start living your life. Try to sort of make that obvious because it can get lost in the sauce sometimes. All right, and I said, notice the connection to self-actualization here. I said that earlier. And finally, well, not quite finally, almost finally, glove tip safe, existential psychology affirms the centrality of freedom and responsibility. Okay, so these are big, recurrent existential themes for sure, to realize that you're fundamentally free and fundamentally responsible for the quality of your life. Okay, so existential psychotherapy also has to do with intensifying that sense and amplifying that sense and addressing the ways that we avoid and evade and make excuses for ourselves, which we tend to do a lot, and evade the deeper existential reality, which is that we ourselves are the artist, or at least can be the artist, of our own existence, of our own life, and that we're responsible for how that plays out or not. So within the limits of our given situation, the quality of our lives is mostly the product of our choices from an existential point of view and laying claim to responsibility for our choices. So here's a way of thinking about it. So just hypothetically speaking, suppose that the very complex equation that determines the quality of your life as you experience it, suppose that the main variable in that equation is your freedom and your responsibility for your choices. Are there other variables? Of course, it's a complex equation. You know, your genetic endowment would be one set of variables, like how you're sort of embedded within the larger cultural matrix would be another set of variables. But suppose the main variable, the most important one, was the choices you make and how responsible you are for your choices, and that the whole temptation to sort of make excuses for yourself or try to fob off your problems onto someone else, like that is mostly to your detriment. That's not a mode of empowerment, that's a mode of disempowerment. If you really want to empower yourself, you got to start to make powerful, responsible choices and be willing to commit to them and live them out. Okay, just a thought. This is a really different paradigm from the culturally dominant one that you're probably being offered along the way. So if you have the feeling like, well, dude, you're sort of running against the grain there, it's like, yeah, you know, you're going to have to develop courage at some point in your life. Sorry, the universe is that way. Okay, so, and finally, here's the final thing. Existential psychology and psychotherapy also affirms the value of committing to your way of being, committing to your life, not just sort of moving through it, you know, sort of phlegmatically or robotically or something like that, but just like really digging in, like really committing with passion, with real passion, to finding and living out your distinct, unduplicatable way of being in this weird world in which you've been thrown. Okay, so living it out with passion and verve, that's how I said it in your notes, rather than living your lives in a more or less mechanical or robotic way. Okay, so those are some of the goals and features of existential psychotherapy, probably existential psychology more generally. And what we're going to do in the next video, because we're about to end this one, is we're going to do a brief tour of a whole bunch. Let's see how many of them there are. 9 different existential thinkers, and for each thinker we're going to be sort of noting some of the main features of his contribution to the domain of existentialism, so that you can get sort of an idea what all of this is about. So once again, you can sort of figure out whether existential psychology is something you're going to be interested in. If so, there's a course offered here at West Georgia about it. Usually I teach it, as a matter of fact. Shameless plug. But anyhow, at any rate, if you end up being interested by this stuff, then yeah, definitely you want to move toward that class. If you are not interested in this, you need to run from that class for sure, because it'll just be 15 weeks of irritation for you. So, hope you're having a great day here in the coronavirus apocalypse. I'm looking out the window as I usually do at the end of these videos. Oh, I forgot to wear my hat in this video. I hope my hair didn't sort of bother you too much. I just showered, so maybe it's more under control. At any rate, hope you have a great one. See you in the next video. Take care.